We're good?
Whenever you're ready.
All right, thank you, Chloe. Good morning. It's great to have you all here to talk about our favorite priority in the Controller's Office, procurement reform. Not something that we often can get cameras for. But in all seriousness, too often strengthening procurement processes falls to the bottom of every municipal government to-do list until corruption or scandal emerges. What's happening across the street at City Hall is deadly serious. Of course, we don't yet have all the details, but with headlines suggesting that a lobbyist or an unregistered lobbyist may have secured meetings with siblings for clients, suggesting bribery of department chiefs, suggesting misuse of police resources, and suggesting corruption in no-bid procurement. None of it instills trust in city government. And that's just a small part of the bigger picture. New York's procurement landscape is massive. Last year, the city entered into 12,820 new procurement contracts, valued at over $38 billion. That's more than the budgets of 30 states. So unless we have clear policies in place to prevent corruption and ensure integrity, we're in for a lot of abuse. New York City relies on those contractors for so many basic services, from childcare and home-delivered meals to school construction and technology and transportation and security and food and cleaning, on and on. We've got to be able to count on city agencies to conduct fair and transparent bidding without favoritism, and to make sure we're getting what we pay for. But right now, we increasingly rely on no-bid contracts, and much of the time, we don't even know what subcontractors we're paying for. This is one of the things that has stunned me the most. For example, in the recent DocGo audit that we did, 67% of that $432 million contract is for subcontractors. In that case, for security, for cleaning, for food, for hotels. Not a single one of them was properly registered and had been approved, in that case by the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, and yet we've written hundreds of millions of dollars to DocGo to pay their subcontractors. And this is quite common. There were more than a dozen agencies last year that registered 0 subcontractors in the payment information portal, and we know actually the vast majority of subcontractors are being paid without ever being approved. Since I took office in 2022, we've worked hard to strengthen our role in procurement oversight. We hired a dynamite deputy controller for contracting and procurement who's worked as the ACO or in the ACO shop of 4 city agencies to make sure we're doing our job. So they've stepped up the level of detail in which we look at the contracts that arrive here. So we turn them around on time. The charter only gives us 30 days to do it, and I think the average right now is 18. And yet they're looking at every one of those contracts, and there's some examples in the report this morning of places where they've caught something and sent it back to the agency. And in many of those cases, the agency basically withdrew the procurement at that point or substituted an appropriate subcontractor where there hadn't been one in place. We've put out a ton more transparent information. Many of you are foiling us to get those contracts. We put them up on Checkbook NYC. For asylum seekers, we created a whole new portal. And the detail in the annual contracts reports that Deputy Controller Hamamjian and her team have put out has gone consistently into more and more detail. And across a number of reports, we've proposed common sense reforms to protect public integrity while balancing with the need for efficiency and flexibility. Many of the recommendations in this report today come from the work that Charlotte and her team have already put together on no-bid contracts, on subcontracting, and on transparency. So what we're proposing today is let me just go a little more into things we did even before now. I think it's worth pointing out After I got elected and before taking office, I reached out to the then mayor-elect to create a joint task force to focus on procurement. The first recommendation of that task force was to create a more transparent system called contract stat, which still does not exist despite promise after promise after promise. We've called out over-reliance on emergency procurement, which led us to yanking the prior approval we had given for asylum seeker shelter because it was being abused. We've audited service providers who overly rely on undisclosed subcontracts like .go, but there have been a number of other audits of those city contractors, and promoted increased transparency through the tools I mentioned like Checkbook. And today, we're recommending 4 critical reforms. First, strengthening oversight of subcontractors, including making sure we're not paying for subcontractors that the city has not approved, which again, unfortunately, we are now doing most of the time. Second, reducing over-reliance on emergency procurement and no-bid contracts, which have grown under this administration. And obviously, when you aren't bidding a contract out, but just selecting a single contractor, maybe that you've already been working with, or maybe that you've been introduced to, the risks for procurement, for corruption grow up dramatically. We're calling again to close corruption vulnerabilities in the city's oversight of nonprofit human service contracts. These recommendations were laid out originally in a 2021 Department of Investigations report, which honestly should have been implemented by the Procurement Policy Board before we even got here. A year later, when they still hadn't been, we wrote a letter to the PPB calling for the implementation of the DOI recommendations, and they still have not happened, almost 3 years into the administration. And fourth, increasing transparency to promote accountability. In a number of ways, we're calling for new reporting of political contributions from people who are seeking contracts and looking at other reasons why we should be cautious. And as I mentioned, calling for the long-delayed implementation of contract stat, a promised tool to enable New Yorkers to see more about what's going on in procurement. You guys know it. New Yorkers know it. Public integrity is the linchpin of city government. You've got to have confidence that when city agencies are putting out taxpayer dollars, they're doing it appropriately. They're bidding it out to multiple bidders to get the best price. They're making sure that the contractors who have the opportunity to bid are not under indictment, are not related to someone in the agency or at City Hall, that it's fair and transparent and designed to get the best price for taxpayers. New Yorkers deserve honest, trustworthy, well-managed city government that safeguards our taxpayer dollars against waste, fraud, and abuse. This is a moment of crisis, let's be clear, and we should use that moment to make real changes so people can wake up every day trusting their government to work for them. Now look, some of the things that have been alleged are already against the law. Let's be clear, there's some laws we just need enforcement of. It's already illegal to have an unregistered lobbying agency lobby the agency led by your brother. But there are many areas where our procedures and policies are weak, or where our practices, like not registering those subcontractors, have created gaping holes through which corruption seeps. So that's why we thought it was an important time to bring these proposals forward, to underline some things we've been calling for a long time, to identify a few new things we could do to tighten up procurement risks, and to make sure that we tie down, that we strengthen, that we ensure that New York City is spending taxpayer dollars carefully. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Deputy Controller Charlotte Hamamjian. She'll go into a little more of the details in these proposals, and then we'll be glad to take your questions.
Good morning, and thank you, Controller Lander. I am Charlotte Hamamjian, Deputy Controller for Contracts and Procurement. As the Controller said, at the forefront of the city's Procurement and Policy Board rules are the underlying purpose of those rules. Chief among them are the mandate that city procurement provides for increased public confidence in the city's public procurement system, fosters effective, broad-based competition from all segments of the vendor community, including small businesses and MWBEs, and to safeguard the integrity of the procurement system and protect against corruption, waste, fraud, and abuse. As the Comptroller said, we're looking at 4 areas to strengthen procurement to reduce corruption vulnerabilities. If implemented, these reforms will not only help to achieve the tenets set forth in the Procurement Policy Board rules by preventing corruption and abuse, but will also support efforts to streamline the procurement process, increase meaningful MWB participation through broad and fair access to contracting opportunities rather than through pre-existing personal relationships, and ensure timely payments to the vast majority of city contractors who are providing responsible and high-quality goods and services. In order to strengthen the oversight of subcontractors, we propose the following. As the Comptroller said, and what might seem basic, prohibit payments to vendors for work performed by unauthorized subcontractors. Incorporate restrictions on third-party contractors and subcontractors so that they cannot be owned or controlled by related parties or relatives, and strengthen anti-nepotism provisions and oversight to foster competition and protect against favoritism. Better measures to enforce that agencies and vendors, as the Comptroller mentioned, input subcontractor requests, approvals, denials, and subcontract details into city reporting systems, conduct integrity reviews for potential fraud, perform consistent, detailed reviews to determine if significant subcontracting and vendor transactions are with related parties, and if so, whether or not they are compensated excessively, and review bidding documents to ensure that the vendor selected the most cost-effective subcontractors available among the qualified and responsible bidders. To reduce over-reliance on emergency and non-competitive procurements, we recommend that the city prohibit non-competitive procurements with any entity undergoing federal investigation for corruption or fraud. Integrate risk assessments and data-driven forecasting tools into procurement planning. Transition goods and services provided under emergency contracts to a competitively sourced contract whenever possible. Strengthen accountability for vendor integrity and performance evaluation reviews, and reform emergency procurement rules to increase accountability. To close corruption vulnerabilities in nonprofit contracts, many of the recommendations here, as the Comptroller mentioned, were already in the DOI report from 2021. Providers should be required to complete a standard disclosure and certification form to identify potential conflicts of interest and noncompliance with the city's competitive bidding requirements. Agency budget staff should be directed and trained to implement standard operating procedures to check leases with allocation plans, and that expenses are reasonable and necessary to fulfill the conditions of the contract. Agencies should collect additional disclosures from human service providers when they report that goods or services were procured through a related entity in order to identify potential conflicts of interests and their impact. And providers should be required to disclose costs that are being allocated in order to ensure that our expenses are allowable and not double billed. And finally, to increase transparency, as the Comptroller mentioned, the Adams administration must launch Contract Stat as was promised. We need to shed light on where delays in the city's procurement process are occurring and direct agencies and oversight efforts to clear those backlogs and delays and prevent them from reoccurring each year. It should be a requirement that executives and principals of vendors disclose campaign contributions for the previous 5 years along with every contract submitted for registration, and the city needs to expand and enforce existing requirements to disclose the compensation of executive staff and how that compensation is allocated to cover every contract submitted for registration. By implementing the recommendations, we can build a stronger city that ensures the best possible use of public resources, provides high-quality services, expands opportunities, closes corruption loopholes, and strengthens trust in city government. I want to give a thank you to Deputy Comptroller for Policy and Organizing, Annie Levers, and members of my team, including Assistant Comptroller Michael D'Ambrosio and Senior Advisor Daphne Agami, for preparing the report and its set of recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Controller, and I also want to thank Assistant Controller D'Ambrosia and Policy Deputy Controller Annie Levers for putting the report together, and as much as that, for all the work that's behind it. I would encourage you to look at the appendix that lists some of the contracts that we've sent back, many of you of which you've written on in the past, and there's a lot of good work underlying this report. With that, we'll take questions.
We're going to do on topic first, and then we'll do off topic, and by that I mean enough so that our deputy controller can step off the plate here. Andrew.
In your review of contracts, have found evidence of corruption, and specifically in contracts involving some of the folks that you mentioned at the top of your remarks, anything involving Tim Pearson or Terry Banks in contracts that you've reviewed, and if so, can you talk about it?
I'll answer, and then Charlotte can. I mean, to my knowledge, we have not found any contracts where, you know, what the Deputy Controller Hamamjian's team typically asks in a contract review is, where did we hear about this contractor? That's just one way of knowing where you're getting people. So if you do a public bid and everyone's aware of it and multiple people will respond, great. If you were doing emergency procurement, who was the recommender? Where did that come from? Why did you choose them? I'm not aware of any situation where the answer we got to any of those questions was Terrence Banks or Tim Pearson. There have been times when the response to those questions from our office was to withdraw the contract. And then there have been times when, as this, we just recently rejected the $5 million extension of the emergency procurement for the NYPD facade, where somebody got chose originally. In that case, there was a subsequent indictment of that contractor, and we said, did you pay any attention to that when you decided to extend their contract? And that was the reason why we ultimately rejected that one. And I should say, we don't normally have the ability to reject. Normally what we can do is return. We send it back to the agency with a list of questions. On emergency procurement, prior approval is needed, and so in that case, on the $5 million one, we were allowed to reject.
Just following up on what you said in some cases you've asked a question and then the contract was withdrawn or pulled. Basically, you've asked City Hall, what is this about? And they say, never mind, and they take it off the table. Can you just explain what you're talking about there?
There are instances where, as a result of the contracts that come to us for registration, which is that 30-day review, after they've gone through their process of sourcing the vendor, and in our course of asking questions, they have withdrawn the contract. In some instances, they have resubmitted it once they have been able to gather the responses to our questions. In other instances, they have chosen to not move forward with the contract. In some instances, not related to your earlier question, in some instances, the agency and its oversights have admitted that while perhaps not fraud or corruption on the part of the agency, they did not follow and comply with the city's procurement rules.
Comptroller, you mentioned that it's hard to get attention to this topic, and that's why you're raising it now. But this seems like a really zeroed-in focus on no bid contract and kind of opaque subcontractors. It doesn't quite seem to be in line with the pay-to-play that's being alleged across the street. So are you drawing a straight line to that, or are you just saying it's a good time to talk about it?
We have expanded. I mean, there is there are two new recommendations in here that speak more to what's been going on recently. One is to require that bidders disclose political contributions that they've made in the process. And the other, that contractors under indictment not be eligible for procurement. So those are two new recommendations that we've made that are a little more directly responsive. Look, as I said before, many things are already against the law, and what you need is a city hall and agencies that are complying with the law, and when that doesn't happen, then you wind up with investigations, as is what is taking place right now. At the same time, if you have an administration that hasn't been taking procurement integrity seriously, you wind up with a broader set of challenges, and I do think there's a resonance, let's say, between a city hall where the kinds of practices that are being alleged now are of concern, with a lack of commitment to integrity throughout the procurement process. You know, if you're not requiring people to get their subcontractors registered, you know somewhere in those unregistered subcontractors are essentially lower levels of the same thing. Look, NYCHA is a good example here, right? You saw recently this is what, 9 months ago, there was a round of indictments of NYCHA, folks kind of closer to the ground, who have authority under those processes to give out contracts without a sufficient level of bidding oversight or review. We have been proposing from the beginning of the administration strengthening a set of those procedures. Again, some of them coming from recommendations by the Department of Investigation, and essentially none of those things have moved forward. And I do think when you've got an administration that is not signaling procurement integrity matters, we are looking at it in all of these other ways, it's not that surprising that you might wind up with a lot of it.
So what you're saying is this is a broader package to address what feeds a culture of corruption? Am I don't want to
Yes,
put words
I think that's a fair way to say it.
Okay.
Jason.
Mr. Comptroller, first of all, to follow up on my colleague's question about, just to put a point on it, have you flagged any contracts related to involving Tim Pearson or Terrence Banks or any of the federal probes that we've now become aware of? Have you flagged any contracts even tangentially related to those probes or the actors?
I mean, obviously, we can't really know until we see more what comes forward from what, you know, we don't have information from prosecutors about which contracts they're looking at. We frequently, I shouldn't say frequently, but there's a good number of times that we have shared information with the Department of Investigation. So if we see something that we think is suspicious or untoward, there's a set of reasons that the Deputy Controller mentioned where something doesn't meet the requisites for procurement, and then we return or reject the contract. If we suspect something, then what our job is to do is to let DOI know, and then they pick up the investigation, and we've done that on a number of occasions. I can't say whether that overlaps with what the U.S. Attorney's offices are looking at. I'm not aware of any situation where, in particular, with Terrence Banks or Tim Pearson, we have seen their names in the contracts that we have reviewed.
So when you see all of this happening all around the mayor, if you as a comptroller, do you say to yourself, like, gee, like I wish my office caught this?
Well, I mean, I'm proud of the work that the team has done. You can see the list of things in the appendix here where we did send something back. Our job is not, we're not prosecutors, we're not the FBI. Our job is to make sure procurement procedures are followed properly, and we've got a first-rate team that does it. You know, I think in the time that we've been in office, so we've seen we've registered probably over 30,000 contracts. It's a big job, and Charlotte's team is, how many are you?
About 30.
About 30 people. For that, I feel really proud of the things we found, the things we've prevented, and the set of recommendations that we've made for making change. We'll have to see what comes from the U.S. Attorney's offices.
Yeah, kind of following up on that, our reporting as well as the AP has reported that two companies in particular, 20% Ed and Safer Watch, may be a part of these.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if your office has now looked into these, or if in the past those companies have raised red flags for you.
Yeah, so 21st Century Ed, we did take a look at once it was in the news. The vast majority of those are procurements out of the schools themselves, and they're under $25,000. So they don't come to our office for registration. Obviously, you've got 1,700 schools in the city, and they're doing more modest procurements pretty regularly. And if they're under 25 grand, they don't come to our office. And we thought about whether we should propose changing that they do. That would, we would need a lot more staff to be able to review the volume of, like paper purchases from New York City public schools. We couldn't do it with the 30 staff we have. So we'll be talking more with other players in city government to think about whether something like that is needed. I think that'll have to come once we know more about what's in these investigations.
Okay, and Safer Watch, did you go back to that one?
Safer Watch was, the only purchases with Safer Watch were through the NYPD, and those were also at purchase order levels similar to the DOE purchases.
So that is something that we'll keep an eye on. If what comes out of these investigations is pervasive corruption at levels, normally you would look at larger contracts like that $432 million .go contract. If what people are doing here, hypothetically, is finding a way to do so much of the getting of these under $25,000 contracts from schools that reforms of that system is needed, then we'll consider what it would look like to do that reform.
Great,
Good morning. So after laying out some of these steps to help root out corruption, is there anything that your office can do or any mechanisms in place to ensure that city agencies will actually adopt or adhere by some of these practices?
It's a great question. This is where City Hall leadership is needed, and we actually looked at what would it take to implement these policies. And could some of them be done by legislation so that if City Hall won't change the policies and actually enforce them, legislation could be put in place. But it's unclear because the charter assigns the Procurement Policy Board with the procurement rulemaking. And when you change the charter, you might need a referendum that might have to go to the voters in the same way that advice and consent legislation would, which the mayor is blocking the voters from getting. Most of the changes that we are proposing would be Procurement Policy Board rules changes. That's a board of 5 people, one of whom is Charlotte, and I even have a second appointee. Unfortunately, the other 3 appointees, and therefore the agenda setting and all of the voting on the PPB majority is controlled by the mayor. I just give the DOI recommendations as the most straightforward example. I mean, here you have a DOI investigation. It comes out with concrete recommendations. They call for rules changes. They don't get voted on. The 2 comptroller members of the PPB write a letter saying, remember that DOI investigation? Why don't we implement those policies? And they still don't get calendared for a vote.
Joel, is there any sense that there's a purposeful effort to get in under that $25,000 threshold?
I think that's one of the questions that it sounds like investigators are looking at. We don't have insight into it because if they don't come here, we don't have the data. We put out all the data on every contract we register. They wind up both in Checkbook NYC, and then we do this great annual summary report, the annual contracts report. The team also does a really good report every year on MWBE procurement. That was a place we actually really looked at the subcontractor question last year. But on these, what are sometimes called micro purchases of under 25,000, that's not something we currently see. So if that is what is found in the investigations, then that'll definitely be a place where more reform might be needed.
Jack?
Comptroller, on these investigations, have you seen enough information from the investigations where you think that either David or Philip Banks or Sheena Wright should resign?
Well, we haven't seen any, we've seen reporting, but we haven't seen the results from the investigations. And I would like to see that information before I reach a judgment on those questions. What I would say is we've seen enough to believe there is a culture that is allowing corruption in procurement, and that needs change. And that needs both policy change of the kind that we're proposing today, and it needs management reform from City Hall and at both the PD and the Department of Education.
As you know, some are calling on mayor to resign and say the mayor should step down. 3 state legislators at least, and then 1 member of the city council. Do you think the mayor should resign?
Look, this is why I'm running to replace him. We don't know what's in all the investigations, and I would like to have more information. But this is a city hall in crisis. It's a crisis of trustworthiness, and it's a crisis of distraction. New Yorkers deserve trustworthy, focused leadership, and that's why I'm running to replace Mayor Adams.
I'm not sure you answered the question.
I'm not today calling on him to resign. What today I'm saying is we need to strengthen our procurement system so we can actually have trustworthy city government. What I am saying is Mayor Adams is not delivering the safer, more affordable, more livable, and better run city and more trusted city hall that New Yorkers are demanding, and that's why he should be a one-term mayor.
Nick?
And then sort of related to that, since we actually have just been asking City Hall about those same recommendations, they sent us a statement a few days ago where they said that they created a vendor compliance cabinet, and that they also have groups, I think, related to that cabinet. They're working on a related party transaction policy and also a citywide policy to establish a single audit. I don't know exactly what all of those mean, but was those in any way they claim that that would address some of the recommendations?
Thanks for sharing that. That had not been shared with us. And in the spirit of, the collaboration with which the report in February 2022 was released, many of these procurement reform initiatives, including the launching of Contract Stat, was something that we were committed to partnering with the administration on. And as in the instance of Contract Stat, which we have not been a party to and have very little detail on, the initiatives that you mentioned are also new to us.
Jason?
You mentioned in your remarks that when you were elected to this office, but before being sworn in, you reached out to the mayor-elect and you wanted to create a joint task force.
We did create the joint task force, yes, even before we got here.
Could you just tell me a little bit, what was that conversation like? What what was the impression that you got in terms of his willingness to be transparent and collaborate and really, dive into making sure that the procurement process is right?
I mean, if you guys go back and you'll remember it, you can find a lot of places where he said at the beginning of the administration, this is going to be the most transparent administration in history, where I encourage the controller to conduct audits and bring recommendations for improvements. Very, very little of that has come to fruition. Specifically on the Joint Task Force on Contracting, we started working on that during transition. Deputy Controller Levers was part of the transition team. Her team worked most closely with, so at the time, now First Deputy Mayor Sheena Wright was transition chair or helping lead the transition. And she, of course, has a long history in kind of the nonprofit and contracting and procurement space. So a joint task force was put together that was both staff from first their transition and our transition, and then once we got here, the mayor's office and our office, both the Bureau of Contract Administration and the policy team. And then we had a whole kind of task force of, in that case, mostly nonprofit leaders, but by then we were also already talking to a wider array of vendors, and we came up with a whole series of recommendations. Some of that about streamlining. I mean, and let's not forget, it still takes us, on average, 10 months after the date a contract is supposed to be starting to actually have the contract where they get it to us, we register it and people can start getting paid. So the vast majority of our vendors are operating at risk for a long period of time in a way that doesn't help any of these things. So we were proposing recommendations there, but really the first thing we proposed was this contract stat tool, so you'd start to have more transparency in how different procurement agencies and oversight agencies are doing in procurement. That was literally recommendation number 1. And here I think it was supposed to take a year and change, and here we are nearly 3 years later, and not only isn't it operating, we have no reason to believe it ever will be in this administration.
So has he told you, 3 years later, 2 years later, like, have you said, hey, what's going on with this? What is it going?
Oh, I mean, we've asked about contract stat more times than I could count. For the first 2 years, the answer was, we're working on it, it's coming, we'll have something at some point. For most of the last year, we can't get an answer at all.
Jeff?
So I just want to follow up on the resignations question.
On what, sorry?
On the question about resignations.
Yeah.
Phil Banks, Tim Pearson are still employed. No sense that they are going to be asked to resign or forced to resign. I'm wondering, do you have any idea why? What do you think about the mayor not asking these people to resign? And secondly, you're running for mayor. I'm wondering, how would you handle the situation if your, deputy mayor for public safety and your senior advisor both were caught up in federal investigations? Would they still be in your administration?
I would have fired them long ago. I mean, I wouldn't have hired them in the first place, but I would have fired them long ago. And I guess I will say here, people have not been kind of connecting that. I don't know that those two positions are on the advice and consent list of the council, but I do think it would be a good time to kind of look across, and see, like, this is I don't know how you could be a city hall that is saying we don't need more oversight of our appointments when your administration is under the constant drip of investigations and raids.
Do you have a sense why the mayor hasn't fired these individuals?
I mean, I have not had a conversation with him about it, no.
Inevitably, when we ask the mayor about these topics, I'm attempting to give you a rebuttal to what we may hear about an hour from now when the mayor sits down with many of these people.
Yeah.
They often lean on, this was emergency procurement, we need to be nimble, we need to cut the red tape. So what say you to a response of, we're looking at this packet of recommendations, this looks like a bunch of red tape, and how are we supposed to run the city? What say you to that critique of adding more bureaucracy?
Well, first I'll say, even as we have stepped up our scrutiny, we've streamlined the time it takes. So, the charter gives us 30 days, and we've got it down to about 18. And yet we are looking at all those contracts and providing the scrutiny. When you've got good policies in place, then you can have your procedures functioning and still get things done on time. Let's take the asylum seeker. Actually, I'll give 2 examples. Let's take the asylum seeker contract. So for that first month or two in the summer of 2022, we did need emergency procurement. That's why we granted the blanket prior approval at that moment. When you started having buses coming, you didn't know were going to be coming, and it was your responsibility to get people in shelter beds every night. Okay, you don't have time that day to put out an RFP. Once you know, though, which we did by probably September of 2022, that this is going on continually, then you put out a request for proposals and you say, here's what we need. We need shelter and services and food and legal services and a pathway to housing. Please put a proposal together that tells us what your experience is and your criteria, what your price would be. And then we'll select vendors to do that. And now, instead of secret no-bid emergency procurements, you've got a transparent process that could have been in place probably by the end of 2022. They still have not done that. Still have not done it. They promised they would do it when we were able, after a year, to reject and end the .go contract, but there has not yet been an RFP to bring on that set of vendors. And then maybe we'll give the other example of this NYPD facade. So, okay, a brick falls off the building. You need an emergency contractor. Fine, you get somebody in that day to stabilize the building. then you think, you know what we're probably going to have to do? Replace the facade. So why don't we bid it out to a decent set of contractors and see, get the best price and a good contractor? What they did is like leave the scaffolding up for how many years? 2 years, and then say, oh my God, it's 2 years since that brick fell. Now it's an emergency. We need to do the facade replacement work. I guess we'll just have to hire the same contractor we chose on that day of emergency, even though he has since, so that contractor has since, been indicted specifically for bilking city agencies through procurement fraud. Yeah, I mean, that's not red tape. That's just preventing corruption, and City Hall needs to do it.
So Holly,
One other question, follow up to his argument question. At what point would you feel comfortable calling for Mayor Adams to resign? What developments would need to happen to get there?
I mean, I would like to see what's in the federal prosecutor's investigations, and it's hard to like engage in hypotheticals with what might be in them. We'll see what's in them, and then I'll make that call. I want to see what's in the investigations rather than imagine a lot of hypotheticals. Look, it's serious stuff. I mean, everybody knows it's serious stuff. These are reasonable questions. I understand why the other elected officials have said what they have. I would like to see those investigations and understand really what they found before I make that decision.
okay, any more on topic? Any off topic? And I'm going to give our deputy controller and assistant controllers the ability to exit stage left.
Thank you.
Any off topics?
This was a pretty broad definition of on topic, I think, Chloe, so.
You all allowed to whatever, but,
Distinctly different.
yeah,
The
distinctly
subway
different.
shooting.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, you ran kind of with I'm really not trying to be derogatory here, but like creative sort of vision for the comptroller's office, including using it to bring NYPD reform. Is shooting at a suspect who had a knife on a crowded subway platform appropriate? And if not, are you going to take a look at policies and procedures because of this incident?
Yeah, I mean, no, it was not appropriate to open fire in a crowded subway for turnstile jumping in a way that wound up hitting an officer and 2 other bystanders. And I do think it's connected to the broader chaos at the NYPD when there's not accountability for brass at the top, when there's not clarity that leadership and management matter, that there will be accountability. It's hard throughout the department. We've got a role in the controller's office, which is looking specifically at the finances, at doing audits of particular places where we're spending, of looking at the overtime. We did the ShotSpotter audit. We'll keep doing that work in the controller's office. On the campaign trail for mayor, of course I will be articulating how I would lead a safer city. And you'll hear a lot more from me about that as the campaign moves forward.
Any other completely off topics? Going once, going twice. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Chloe.